Well, hello, everybody, and happy Thursday, and welcome to the 132nd episode of Stories of Service Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. And I'm the host of Stories of Service, Teresa Carpenter. And today, as we always do, I have another amazing guest. It's like every single week, or sometimes twice a week. I can't believe that I get to talk to the people that I do. Corie Weathers, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me, Teresa.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to come on. I believe that you have so much experience, both lived experience, research experience, counseling experience. It's just going to be a pleasure to talk to you. And today, what we are going to be talking about is military culture and the way that Corie has done a study and throughout her life, the things that she's observed from generation to generation and ways that we can ultimately understand each other. She is a licensed professional counselor, a speaker, a consultant, an award-winning author. And as I said, she wrote the book Military Culture Shift: The Impact of War, Money, and Generational Perspectives on Morale, Retention, and Leadership and Sacred Spaces. And she's also written and the other book that she wrote was Sacred Spaces: My Journey to the Heart of Military Marriage. For 20 years, she's been an LPN, licensed professional counselor, LPC rather, and traveled internationally to visit troops and report on deployment conditions, and taught service families across the globe. She also consults organizations and institutions on building trust, creating impactful programming, and working with a multi-generational team. Welcome again, Corie.
Thank you so much. Every time I hear that, and I know I wrote it like a long time ago, I'm so tired. No, but no, it's really truly a military spouse journey of what does it mean to create a creative career about something you're really passionate about. And so I know sometimes when we hear people's bios, it's, we have all kinds of thoughts, but really this is all centered on how do you serve this tribe that we all care about so much, and trying to use the talents in creative ways as we are still active duty and are relocating all the time. So thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Well, I'm looking forward to having it. And I always start my conversation out with all my guests who have that military affiliation. But even if they don't, I like to know their background. So tell me a little bit about where you were born and raised and your journey into the military.
Yeah, born actually in Charleston at the Naval Hospital. There, my dad is a retired Air Force pilot. He was in the reserves at the time. By the time I was born, he was flying for Delta Airlines. Hence the information that I have in the book as far as the Delta fiasco of their pensions. But so I was born in Charleston, but we quickly moved to Atlanta, where he flew Delta out of Atlanta. And then married my husband out of college, like a week out of college. This military lifestyle was not even on our radar, not even something we were thinking about. And then fast forward, we were in graduate school, and he ran into a Green Beret in the gym there at graduate school and came home one day and said he wanted to join the military. And I said no. For about a year and a half, I said, no, this is not something that I was on track to go into counseling and open a practice and whatever that might look like. Just is not even, and even my dad, who was in the reserves, we didn't have the typical military lifestyle. I wasn't a military brat necessarily. And so after about a year and a half, I was like, he's really serious about this. This is something he really wants to do. And so to give just how naive I was like, fine, go do your boot camp thing, and then we'll talk when you get back. So all that to say, our first assignment when we finally went active duty completely changed our lives for good, and also this incredible roller coaster that we've been on since. And so we've never looked back, and we knew when we came in, we were going to come in as a team. And even though that's meant at times a team serving in independent ways, we both have the same heart for seeing this community do well and finish strong. So that's how I got to where I am.
That's amazing. And I did see the chaplain, which is wonderful. We need our faith healers in the military desperately. And so it's wonderful to hear that. And I also saw, it's a little bad printout, but I printed out your one-page speaker bio, and I saw that you are also the Armed Forces Insurance Military Spouse of the Year about 8 years back. So congratulations on that. I watched your interview on the Today Show. What was that like to get that award?
Oh my goodness. It was, well, first of all, my husband nominated me at the time thinking I was going to get this nice little certificate that I had just done some good work, and she needed, like, this certificate of appreciation, not realizing amazing. It was so much bigger than that. And so I
Massive.
did. I got Army Spouse of the Year, and that led to going to DC and being awarded the overall Spouse of the Year. And that the next day, going to the White House, going to the Today Show. So it was like being thrust into the spotlight. And within that year, I also had the opportunity, because of that visibility, had the opportunity to travel with the Secretary of Defense overseas to visit troops. And that's what turned into writing the book, Sacred Spaces. And so that trajectory took my clinical background. By trade, I'm a counselor and had always wanted to and had been serving military, just service members and spouses and kids behind confidential doors. But by that point, I was really seeing there was these themes that were showing up in each session that I was like, man, we need to have a bigger conversation culturally. And so that award brought me into this trajectory of serving people in a different way, in a more public way, but also gave me a chance to travel, as speaking engagements came from that. Consulting was born kind of after that. And really just being able to take some of these themes that I had originated in the counseling office, still seeing them in the counseling office, but really testing them out with different groups all over the globe to see if these issues were happening everywhere. So I still am that clinician by trade, but have now shifted more into speaking, teaching, and coaching.
So tell me a little bit about some of those themes, some examples of some of the things that you saw that were patterns within military families as some of the issues that you were recognizing.
Yeah, and it really was dependent on what was happening at the time, right? So when I was doing sessions individually with family members, especially during GWOT, those 2 decades of war and global conflict, a lot of the spouses I was seeing were definitely struggling with resentment and burnout, and not necessarily talking to their service member about it. They were bringing it in the session, but didn't know how to talk about it. So really seeing some of these underlying trends and belief systems, some of them destructive, between spouses and their relationship with the DoD, and vicariously in their relationship with service members. Like, why are we not able to talk about our burnout, our resentment, without, and just this mindset of everything was mission first. But then that was even starting to get twisted by spouses going, well, I can't ask him to come home for dinner when he's sitting behind a desk, even when he's at home and we're not deployed. This kind of mission creep where everything became the mission. Staying
Right.
at work till 7 o'clock was about the mission. Not wanting to bring up to a toxic work environment with a leader was not putting mission first. Like, we were getting confused over time about what is the mission, and everybody was passively, in some destructive ways, engaging with the military lifestyle, and even in their marriages, thinking like everything is secondary. And so I was seeing these themes kind of throughout spouses as we were going through GWOT, service members also experiencing burnout, but also these very rich experiences with their battle buddies overseas. So, but yes, we're also like inheriting and collecting all of this trauma, whether it was actual combat trauma, whether it was just the trauma of asking so much of families over that time period, that by the time we got towards the end of those 2 decades, we were really dealing with, what do we do with burnout, and how do we deal with self-care when we don't know how to ask for it, and we don't know how to change anything, and we feel very passive to do anything for our own sake. So lots of trends that happened over time, studying the difference between service members who are able to kind of climb the ladder of what we would call in the clinical world, self-actualization. Like, they're climbing and being promoted. Even if
Mhm.
they're moving, they're kind of still staying in the same job, but kind of raising that level of responsibility and experiencing achievement. Whereas spouses, on the other hand, were kind of cycling on the bottom rung of Maslow's ladder, just kind of staying in survival mode. So there was like these trends of seeing service members actually grow in confidence over time, whereas their spouses, especially if you had the traditional stay-at-home spouse or one struggling with their work or employment,
Mhm. Right.
they're really struggling with their own confidence building. So now we're getting out of alignment in our relationships. So yeah,
That's
there's
interesting.
a
Yeah.
lot that I studied over time.
I had never thought about that, because the person who is the spouse often has to be at the whim of the moves and the career decisions of the other spouse. And what that can do is it can lead to resentment. It can lead to one person thinking, okay, well, at least I'm moving up through the system, even if I'm dealing with a toxic work environment or I'm dealing with this or that, I'm still in control of my destiny and of where I'm going to ultimately be. And then the spouse has to just go along, and that's definitely going to create a divide in that. And then you touched upon another thing, which is the idea that during the wars there really wasn't a opportunity to have these really open discussions about mental health and burnout.
Yeah.
And the problem, and I know you touched upon this in the book, is that we thought that after especially after the withdrawal in Afghanistan, when it really, that's the sort of the touch point of the end of these forever wars, we thought we would be done, but really we've shifted into an entirely new way of being in the military, where even though we're not quote unquote at war, we're still constantly at the lines of call and of duty to do whatever, whether that be the missions that are going on right now with Israel, or what's going on right now with Ukraine. So there really hasn't been this like break that we may have
Yeah.
traditionally seen in the past. Did you observe that?
Yes, and this is the hard part about having these kind of conversations, because I think we would all agree that what we do and what we stand for is incredibly important, and that if we're called upon, and it's for an important reason, that I think all of us would be willing to be secondary to that mission. We all agree by being in this lifestyle that that's important, and we want to place value on that as primary, let's say. But you're right. And we talked about before we started the live and hit record, you were asking me, like, what was the catalyst that made me want to write the book? And really, the Afghanistan withdrawal was it, because I have been studying this culture and just watching and observing, and also trying to treat people as well throughout this 2 decades. We got to COVID, and I call, especially in the book, I call COVID like a psychological breaking point, where we really, the whole world, it was hard for everybody, but when we were going through as much stress as we were, and it was just compounding, COVID was just too much. It just
Mhm.
sent our culture over the top, and we just kind of had this psychological breaking point. And I think we would all agree, yes, there's these sweet moments and these wonderful times throughout our time at any point in this service. There are various points where, if we were honest with ourselves, it was too much. And so what I thought was going to be a breaking point was a false peak. And what we actually went right into the Afghanistan withdrawal. And that's where I saw the culture crash. That's where I saw everybody just kind of like, it threw
Enough is
everyone.
enough. Yeah,
It
enough
was
is enough.
enough.
That's why we saw things like the Stuart Scheller video. We saw just so many different negative news stories about the way in which the withdrawal was carried out. Things that are still being talked about to this day. You alluded in it in a recent social media post where we watched the former Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Miley and General McKenzie, who I
Yeah.
believe was CENTCOM at the time, and their portrayal of how they saw those conditions. And I think what's so interesting, Corie, about the way you characterize things is that you're very quick to see things from so many different angles. And I think sometimes, even myself, I tend to get polarized on how I see some of these issues. And I'm curious if it's because of your counseling background, but I thought you took a pretty measured approach to how you saw their testimony. Whereas I can look at and I can't remember his name, but the gentleman who has a very popular Instagram page, who was the lookout during that day and has also testified in Congress. I just can't remember his name off the top of my head. And but he does not have a very measured approach to how he sees this issue at all. So I'm curious at where you sort of stand on some of these kind of hot issues, and if you think it's a generational thing that they don't understand, or that they were doing the best they can with the tools that they had, or if you think that there's more accountability that's needed.
Yeah, yes to all of that. And that's not a great answer, but I think it does come from a little bit of my counseling background. And started writing the book, like, there was moments that I just wanted to storm the castle like anybody else. There was moments where, even with the Afghanistan withdrawal, where my heart was with everybody, that was, especially boots on the ground. My dad was flying C-130s out of Saigon with Operation Baby Lift. So it was almost like this, like, oh my goodness, like I was pulled in many different directions too. And so I think the clinical side of me, when I started to actually sit down and write, how do I write this in a way where people will actually read it and people will actually listen? I had this idea of, you know, when I do a family counseling session, and let's say I'm bringing a whole family in, it's a multi-generational family, and everybody has different perspectives, different stories, different ways they've experienced whatever issues that we're talking about. And what I find myself saying in these sessions is there's a little bit of truth with everyone. Like everybody's story is valid from their perspective. And so for those that are boots on the ground during that Afghanistan withdrawal, they're going to have a very valid experience and example. Like my husband was the chaplain for 361 that experienced Cop Keating that has now become, the Outpost movie, and Jake Tapper wrote a book about it. And that was our unit. And we were in a place where we should not have been, and we're completely overrun by the Taliban, also demanding accountability and seeing accountability fall on the wrong people. So we've kind of walked through that. And so I think over the years, it was just kind of realizing, everybody is valid here. On some level, I think senior leaders were doing the best that they could. And I have talked with some of those senior leaders. I've talked to some of their spouses. I've kind of watched alongside them as they were doing the best they could, also experiencing horrific moments of this was also the worst thing they had ever been through. And so, I'm also, for the book podcast, I've interviewed now 3 different generations that were their boots on the ground. I have a Gen Z who was a medic at the gate, Abbey Gate, when it exploded. I have a late millennial Gen X on the line who was commanding the airstrip during that. And I also have Scott Mann, who operated the Pineapple Express that rescued so many people, trying to get that multi-generational experience. And everybody's perspectives are valid. So when it comes to my perspective, I do try to have this lens of how do I validate everyone, lean in with curiosity and model what I'm asking other people to do. And also kind of in the back of my mind, have this, just remembering that everybody's doing the best they can. And the institution is not a person. The institution is an institution. And so we can hold the institution accountable for the things that an institution should be held accountable for. And if truth comes out that holds a person accountable as well, then we should ask for that. It's right to ask for that. And that's the mark of a good leader, that they can accept that accountability and responsibility, especially as information comes out. So, I'm not trying to get out of your question, but I would say there's truth to all of it, I think.
I think you're right. And thank you, Andrew Rudd. She said it was Tyler Vargas Andrews. That's the gentleman. And he's been an amazing advocate. He's very prolific on Instagram, and I follow a lot of his work. And he's doing a lot to bring awareness about this issue, as is Scott Mann. He's doing a lot on this issue as well. And you got to talk also to Ryan Sweezy. And Ryan Sweezy, I know, has a very interesting perspective from the standpoint of command investigations and the IG system. And that gets to what you're talking about, where I do think that there are really good people on all sides of these issues who, unfortunately, because of the institution that needs to reform itself with some of these systems, some of these issues tend to be bigger than I think they would be if they had the proper resources or the proper tools in place to handle these issues in a different way. I mean, would you, based on what you've seen on some of these issues, do you think some of them really do come back to policy?
Yes. And my interview with Ryan went out this morning and went live this morning. We have a fantastic conversation about what is the psychological dynamics that are at play within the institution that cause us to toe the company line, to not speak truthfully or transparently or hold people accountable when we need to, what's going on with our victims. I think that's a very important conversation. So it is a little bit of policy and regulation, and it's important for any institutional organization to constantly be revisiting and looking at their policy and procedures, the way that they treat people generationally, as we're seeing values shift over time, expectations shift over time. So any organization must revisit those to make sure they're still relevant. But I also think, and what I also try to address in the book, and you really have to see the book, is it is a dense read. We were talking about that as well as before we started too, because there's so many variables that layer on top of each other in order to pull this apart and understand what's going on. It's never just that somebody did something wrong, or that the institution is terrible, or that it's wonderful. So it's all these layers. And so one of the other things we have to look at is, what are the beliefs that we adopt within this culture? We are a subculture of America. We, as American citizens, maybe align ourselves with certain values. Hopefully, I know this is up for a whole other conversation on if we're kind of being pulled apart on all that, but we have commonality with other American citizens. But also in this subculture, we have these traditions and these beliefs and the way that we believe about loyalty, what we believe about the hierarchy system that we have. And so all these beliefs thread into our identity and then affect how we handle these situations. For example, spouses really, like we said in the beginning, struggle with being honest about what it costs them every day to be a spouse within this culture and don't know how to change things or how to ask for help. But service members, and I get to that later in the book, where we actually look at what are some of the beliefs for service members of when do you rock the boat? Can you rock the boat? That dangling carrot. Every time I hear a service member that's like, I don't think I can do any more, then that carrot is dangled in front of them. And then they're like, maybe one more assignment, maybe one more, promotion, maybe, and so those are the beliefs that we have to take a look at of what influences us to make the decisions that we do, whether they are movement forward or whether they're paralysis and nothing at all. Very
well. It is. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I can relate so much to what you said too about the idea of when do you rock the boat and when do you not? Because, I've been a person who has always questioned things, but I've definitely gone up a notch as I've gotten more senior. Well, why? Because I have, and it's quite blunt, is that I know that I'm at that point where if I had to walk away, I know that I could. And I feel that at this point, it is my due diligence and my duty to speak up on the things that I think we need to have conversations about. And I try to do it in a way that always brings respect, always brings reverence to the organization, but hopefully is modeling for other people that they can do the same thing. But it is still very hard. It is very hard for a very junior person in an organization to really speak truth to power and to speak up. And as you said, there's a generational divide about speaking up and about being a change agent, because there is that value, as you said, of respect, of cohesion, of uniformity. It's like the beard issue, for an example. There are people on one side of it that just sees it as it's good order and discipline. We need to all look the same. And then there's this new generation that's coming up and is saying, no, we don't all have to look the same. Men can have beards. Women can have ponytails that come all the way down to the middle of their back, little things like that. I know uniform changes are not little things, but I'm using those as just very basic examples, but all the way to things about, can you share your story online? Can you advocate for change on social media? And these are things that the earlier generations, number one, they didn't have the social media tools to do it. Number two, they didn't speak on podcasts. You didn't see a 4-star going on to a podcast, but then you see somebody like President Zelensky holding a cell phone and talking about issues. Yeah. And so that's where I think this is going one day. And we're just not generationally ready in our top leadership pillars to do that just yet.
Yeah. And this is where it gets honestly very exciting. And I mean in a good way and also an interesting way, is that millennials and Gen Z are coming in and they're unwilling to stay quiet about the things that we've stayed quiet about for so long. And they're willing to leave, and they are leaving if things aren't healthy, or if something doesn't make sense, or if their family needs more support or needs more attention, that they're not willing to toe the company line as much as previous generations. And so they're forcing us, especially, I'm saying us, I'm a Gen X and those that are older, forcing us to have some really serious conversations about whether or not we're willing to adjust those policies. How do we adjust those policies? And how do we, and I've been, so many people have told me, like, you're aging yourself when you say this, Corie, now, by not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I have younger generations that are like, why would you throw the baby out? Like, that's a very good generational question, right? Yeah. And a good challenge, right? But that's the point. Why we can have these conversations about what can change and how we can start having hard conversations. We're already having them online already. We are. We just need the DoD to be able to acknowledge that they're happening and engage in the conversation, and that silence isn't always golden.
Gosh, Corie, I'm telling you, I'm hopeful that a year from now, 6 months from now, I'll have like my first active duty 3 or 4-star general officer or flag officer on my show. And he'll say, "Where were you, Teresa? Why didn't we have this conversation a long time ago?" And it doesn't even have to be my podcast. It could be your show. It could be Permission to Speak Freely podcast. It could be Don't Give Up the Ship. Those are two that are run by one's a prior enlisted sailor, one is a current active duty CPO. And so these conversations are happening. They're especially all over Instagram. And so the sooner that we start to see our GOFO community engaging online, I do believe that a lot of these issues that we already are upset about and talking about, I think a lot of them will be contextualized in the way that you're talking about. Because you're right, the conversations are happening. I know these people are having town halls. I know, I see it all over they're having these conversations in person. But I think that to reach a wider audience, I do believe that it might be important to also bring these conversations up online. And we had a couple questions. My dear friend, Sandy Duchak, she said she's curious if non-military male spouses struggle more than women. And I can understand why she wonders that, because of the lack of let's say cohesion, or maybe not as much of a support structure for male spouses. So curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. And I think the answer, well, I guess suffering is subjective, right? I have a wonderful friend that reminds me of that all the time. She has a husband with a TBI and they have a son with Down syndrome. And the last thing I want to do is ever complain about my life when I talk with her. And she reminds me all the time that my suffering is my suffering and it's
Right.
no different. So but I do think that there is less support. We are still struggling with the spouse culture, knowing how to reach those males, military spouses. So they tend to work more than female military spouses, also still struggling with like portability and all of that. But there is some movement towards incorporating and making sure that they have that space and that they know that they're welcome. But I do hear from a lot of male military spouses that they do feel very much on the outside, very much feel like they don't have the level of support. And just also the stigma when 90% or 95% of spouses are female.
Oh yeah.
Um, then they often get the initial question. And I did this to you, Teresa, when I asked you in the beginning. I was like, "Are you a spouse? Like, what is your military connection?" And you're like, "No, I'm the service member." And I'm like, "I figured, but I didn't know for sure." Right. And male spouses are getting that all the time. They're
Mhm.
like assumed to be the service member. And then when somebody finds out that they're a spouse, it's like, is that less than, or is that, how are you seeing me now? Right.
Mhm.
So the short, I guess the long answer
Mhm.
is yes, I think that they are struggling and struggling in a very different way.
Right. And then we had a couple other questions, and these are some of the people from your social media. She says, as a military first responder spouse, how do we bring it up to our service member what we need from them, how things are affecting us without looking weak to them and the service? Good question.
Yeah, it is a great question. You're going to hear a lot about transparency and honesty because honestly, any kind of secrets or withholding make us sick. And so, first of all, if you are in need, if you are not getting the support that you need, whether it's from your service member or whether it's from the community or the DoD or whatever, like if we are not well, then I always say, let's not abandon ourselves, right? We have value as an individual and as a human, and you have a right to your thoughts, feelings, opinions. I know that sounds scary. And you have a right to ask someone to change behavior if it's destructive to you. All of us have that as a human right. And so when you find yourself in need, it is honoring yourself and valuing yourself to take that to your service member or to your spouse to say, "I'm not doing well. I need fill in the blank. I need you to be more available or present when you're home, or I need to go see my parents," or whatever. And it turned into a conversation. Same
Mhm.
thing with the military. I know that we're talking about adjusting policies and all of that. There's a way to ask for help in kindness. I think when we miss the in kindness piece, that's
Mm,
where it can
great
turn into
point.
possible aggression, if not, and come across entitled. So when you pair your request for help with kindness, people will open their ears and hear it better. So even if you're going to your commander or you're in a town hall and you're in need of something, be honest, be transparent. Um, Practice your words. It's always helpful to do that ahead of time and then ask for that help and give them a chance to win. Everybody's trying to win. So give them a chance to get it right, including your spouse.
Oh, that's such good advice, because I think that when you go at somebody with confrontation and, "Oh my gosh, you screwed up. You did this wrong," whether that be something as devastating, and even Ray Lynn is on the call and she says something along those lines, how she'll never agree with the way the administration
Yeah.
withdrew. The lives lost were horrific. Then it was like life movies. Then it was like movies, on and on. Don't speak about it again. It was like in the movies, just don't speak about it again.
Can I
And
respond to that actually really quick, Teresa? Because I actually wanted to say something about this earlier when you were talking about that we didn't get a break. That was part of that catalyst for me. Not only did we have that after the withdrawal, did we crash, but we all desperately were in need of a break. And when that didn't happen, and the DoD as an institution was silent about 2 decades that we had given everything, and then also the way that person just expressed that we lost people too. And by the way, most of the people that we lost at Abbey Gate were Gen Z, right? And
Mhm.
so that was heartbreaking too. And so when there was radio silence, I think we all experienced a moral injury and we needed reconstitution as a force. And that was the catalyst that made me say, at
Yeah.
some point, we have to experience and express the limits of our human ability to take on more. And when I saw we just shifted our focus towards Russia and China for good reason,
Sure.
but without communication, that's where I knew we needed to tend to our people. And if the institution isn't going to do that, the only thing that we can do is have control over ourselves. And so
Mhm.
how do we tend to our cohort because they're in desperate need of it?
Right, and that was also part of the catalyst for me wanting to start this podcast, even at a risk, to my career professionally, even because I still and was undecided about whether or not I was gonna wanna put on, Captain '06 in the Navy, was because I knew that these conversations needed to be had. I too have, I've been in for 28 years, and I've seen all these different shifts. I've been a part of other conflicts, and when this happened in Afghanistan, it was definitely a watershed moment for me
Mhm.
too, to see that there really wasn't that response from DoD. They focused so much on the fact that 120,000 lives were brought over to the United States without acknowledging the people we left behind, the equipment we left behind, the lives that were lost at Abbey Gate that day, the drone strike problem a few weeks afterwards. There were just so many things that we never really got this. I understand what happened was a tragedy. I am sorry. We
Yeah.
own this mistake. And I think that's what a lot of people just wanted. They wanted to hear that the DoD owned what happened, and nobody really to this day has gotten that. And
Yeah.
I think they just feel like it's too politically uh supercharged to say that. But I feel that that would really go a long way in healing. And you're right, Corie. If that's not going to happen at a larger scale, it does fall to us to have these conversations. And that's one thing I am grateful for, is that we still do have freedom of speech. We still have these mechanisms by which to have these important conversations.
Yeah, and I know people are not going to be thrilled by me saying this, but this was also my journey in trying to understand where do I put my feelings? Where do I put the reaction that I was seeing from so many people too? And I think writing the book was cathartic in that it forced me to look at all these variables and then try to put that in context. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't relationally solve the moral wounding that I think so many of us experienced. But I think that that's why when I posted about the congressional testimony that Millie did the other day, and I think it was McKinsey,
Mhm.
um, where for Millie to say out loud, at least to say out loud, it was a strategic failure. For McKinsey to say, I take ownership for what failed that day, it was a beginning. It was a beginning. And I
Right.
think that it was also understanding that so many of these, again, generational perspectives of what it means to serve and the beliefs threaded throughout that would keep them from saying things. And I think it was also understanding when I interviewed Susie and Nordy Schwartz, who were the Air Force, he was the Air Force Chief of Staff about 2012. I asked them some really hard questions in the podcast where I asked them, like, help us understand from the top, why would people not put their stars on the table? Why would people not say
Mm.
what everybody wants them to say? And I had to lean in with that curiosity and be willing to learn, because what he responded with was, at the end of the day, we are in service to Congress. We are in service to the president and to the American people. And so as much as they want to be able to sometimes just put their stars on the table, and yes, accountability is a whole other thing, I think it gave me just this one other angle of understanding that they have still bosses in front of them
Oh,
and
they
above
do.
them.
And they have a messaging strategy that is not authored by DoD. They have a
Yeah.
messaging strategy that is authored by the administration. So
Yes.
to keep their job and to keep serving and doing the good work that they're trying to do at their level, they are 100% uh, ordered to go along the same line as whatever the administration's messaging strategy is.
Yes,
So
and
they're not,
this
a
is
lot
what
of
I
people don't
say
understand that.
in even marriage counseling. Oftentimes when we're kind of trying to figure out, like, who's to blame and who's
Mhm,
right and who takes responsibility, right? Oftentimes we get down to relationally, relationships are always messy. There's a little
mhm.
bit of truth that everybody holds. Everybody has a right to have their thoughts, feelings, and opinions, and we all have the right to ask somebody to do something different. And then figuring that out and sorting it out is often very messy.
It is, and you have to think too at that 3 to 4, any FOGO level, their entire livelihood and their day to day and their ability to do the work that they're trying to do is directly related to their relationships with Congress, their relationships with the administration. So they're in that same ecosystem, and
Yeah.
so that's why I'm just grateful that there are those FOGOs and those leaders that do retire and
Mhm.
then do speak up about some of
Yeah.
these issues and give us a little bit of that peek behind the curtain so that we can see how some of these decisions get made and why things sometimes happen in a way that people just don't understand. And Chris McGee, he's also on the call, and I know you've had podcasts with him. I just think the world of you, Chris. Keep
Mhm.
doing what you're doing. And he says it's heartbreaking to see someone struggle to bring up something they need and consider how the service will view them once they've done that. It is tough. It really is.
It really is. And that's why I am so proud of those that are willing to bring up going back to the last person's question, right? Bringing up their need, bringing up their struggle, asking for help or asking for assistance. Especially the families who lost somebody so important to them at Abbey Gate on that day are valid in their request for answers, valid in their request for accountability, right? Like, so from the boots on the ground all the way to the top, like, this is a messy situation, and it's always hard to see somebody be honest and ask for that, and then to feel the angst within our community of, like, what's going to happen to that person that they just were transparent right now, right? That's some of the narratives that we need to be adjusting and changing as we find ourselves in leadership and have opportunity to serve people as we serve the mission. Leaning in with curiosity, getting to know their story, seeing that there might be traces of where they're very valid, and how can you as a leader empower them and restore that trust and restore that loyalty within the system from a very honest but human way, I think, is what we're needing.
What do you think is some of the ways to start to bring about change within an organization? Because I think that there is always going to be resistance to change. It's natural. We want to just keep things the way we've always done them. But when we know things are broke, rather than going in there with guns blazing, what are some of the first initial steps that you think we can come together to build consensus for change?
Yeah, some of the wisdom that I have gotten from other people as I've asked those same questions from different angles is, number one, sometimes, especially institutional change, takes far longer than we want it to, but it is like turning a Navy ship. Like, it is turning an aircraft carrier. It's going to take a while, right? And so it's being patient on that. And, when I was talking with Ryan Sweezy about those that he's working with, I know victims especially would love to see change happen immediately. But sometimes it is zooming out and realizing that we can be a part of a change that may take time, but your story was worth it, and your advocacy was worth it, especially if it's the right time and place for you to leverage that. And so that's number one, is just realizing if we're talking institutional change, we have to be patient and know that change can happen. We're seeing millennials have shifted the educational system. They have shifted a lot of our military culture. So it can and does happen. Number two, we have to temper, I think, our anger. I've had to do that many times. My husband was like, "You can't tweet that. You can't post that today. Like, think about it till tomorrow." But I have wisdom and I have people around me that I've had people say, "Hey, Corie, you should take that down." And there's been days that I've said, "You know what? Not today. I thought about this and it's important to do it." And there's been other days that I've said, "You're right." And so having people with different kinds of voices around you help educate you on what can change, what doesn't need to change, what is something that we just don't have enough information on. And so we were kind of pointing at the institution saying that needs to be different, when if we had more information, we understand at least the bureaucracy of why it's taking so long. So as far as starting, I think number one, and this is maybe sounds like a cop out, but I think number one, who can you be and what kind of influence do you have to make changes within the circle of influence that you have? And I think that when you make an impact within the circle that you have, your circle, and you do it well, and you do it relationally, building up those around you within that circle, your circle will naturally expand. We don't get more influence and we don't get more opportunity to make a difference by burning bridges or by destroying relationships. It just doesn't happen. So on some level, we have to learn how to be authentic and honest and truthful. And at the same time, going back to that kindness, working with those around you. And as people trust you, I talk about in the book how trust and authority has shifted. And now Gen Z and especially millennials will trust you if you're a human being. I had a general that asked me, Corie, during a break after training, Corie, what do you do if you don't know how to be transparent? I was like, the answer is, it's not that hard. You just be a human being. Like we just say, yeah, this life is hard. Yes, moving as many times with my kids has been hard. My kids have struggled. And I know that that's hard for you. Just know that you're not alone. That's being human and being authentic. And as people trust you, they give you that authority. And they also then give you power to have influence into their lives. But we don't nowadays, especially, we may gain responsibilities through going up in rank, but that doesn't mean we gain influential power.
No.
There's a difference.
There's a total difference. Nobody really cares about your position if you haven't taken the time to invest in your people and investing into their lives, doing those socials. I'm probably one of the worst at being in big groups. That's not me. I'm more one-on-one, but I know how important it is to be at those tables and to not just do tasking all day long. I think that's also another thing. Like you said, we don't have the same attitudes that we may have had in previous generations when it comes to respect, when it comes to authority. And this generation wants to know, they want to know why. They want to know that you care. And I think even, in my early enlisted days, I always performed better for leaders that I liked, always, or leaders that I knew had my back, or leaders that would get into the muck with me and actually do the things. When I saw a leader, I have a leader now that's like that. He can tell when my boss can tell when I've had enough and I'm doing enough on my end, and he starts just grabbing things. And he's like, no, I got that. I got that. And it makes me respect him and want to keep working for him, because I see that he'll also get his hands dirty. So I think that those kinds of leadership traits will continue throughout the test of time. And I think those even span across generations. Anyway.
Yeah. And let me respond to, I know people would also like some practical, bigger ways that we can start solutioning here, I guess. And so when you have access to other leaders, whether it's just the leader that's right above you, or whether you have access to those in higher up or upper echelons of leadership, being able to go to them and say, what is it that you're trying to succeed at? And how can I help you do that? Right? A lot of times in leadership, we want to impact change for good, and we need people on our team. And so when you can go to somebody and say, how can I help you make this shift for the culture and be a part of that, so you're not doing it by yourself? Most of the time, they need that help. They're looking for information that they don't have access to. They're looking for somebody to tell them the truth. They're looking for what are the issues that they're not hearing about, or messaging things that they're trying to message down that this change is coming, but they're hitting these roadblocks, whether it's the bureaucracy or whether it's the messaging system, whatever. But how do we message that all the way down? So tap into the leadership that's above you and create those win-wins. And then this is also, I walked the dog on this so many times, especially in writing the book, and realizing, man, at the end of the day, this comes down to our vote. When it comes down to shifting an organization and the institution, which is the government, we could blame it on our highest military leaders, who then it goes to Congress, and then it goes to the president. And like all of that comes down to, as American citizens, where do we use our voice to vote if our values are not being reflected in the system? And so that may not make people feel like it's a lot of a power that they feel like they have, but it is something that we have to resurrect our realization of that, and also be willing to take it more seriously, to say that we're at least part of that.
I agree. And I had someone on my show a few weeks back. He is part of a organization that is looking at our political system and some of the things that have damaged our political system to where it's almost set up to where you can't win unless you have a ton of money or unless you
Mhm.
pick a political party. And he's part of a movement that's trying to do something that's called choice voting. And ranked choice voting makes it so that you have to rack and stack who you want to win.
Mhm.
And what that does is it eliminates some of the infighting and the bickering and the
Yeah.
polarization that we see. And he's also a big proponent for Independence for America. That's the organization. And tip of my tongue is his name, but he also really encourages us to run at the local level, run it for your
Mhm.
county board of supervisors, be involved in a nonprofit board. I mean, there are all different ways to be of service, to have a vote, and to get involved, even if you don't feel like you can touch Congress. And then this goes into another question that I know we talked about before the call, which is when we see these military policies that we want changed, we know that the majority of these changes are happening in the National Defense
Mhm.
Authorization Act. And I believe it's your chapter 4 that you go into. This is how the NDA works. But that system is so complicated, it's so convoluted. How can someone get involved in that? And other than writing their local congressman or their senator, and pinpointing the policy change that they want to see, what are some of
Yeah.
your tips on that?
And this is why I know most people are like, "You're writing a chapter on money? Like, who wants to read that?" You know, and I was not even a history nerd, but as I was trying to chase down these very real issues that were
Mhm.
affecting people, it would land on these subjects that I didn't even have all the education about. And so that's why I felt like it's so important for us to understand the NDAA, because it affects our everyday life. And so I tried to write it in a way that's easier to read than, combing through some of the things I had to read through. But the point is that, first of all, having a basic understanding of what the NDA is and why we find ourselves in government shutdowns, and how that impacts not only your leadership, but also impacts your life and how it impacts your families around you. I had a Gen Z couple that said to me last Thanksgiving, that said, I didn't understand. I went to go get my baby an antibiotic, and the pharmacist said, "You better get it today, because tomorrow, if the government shuts down, you're not going to get your antibiotic." And she was like, "What does the government shutdown have to do with my pharmacy?" Everything. Right. And so it's understanding that NDAA, but then it's also understanding, if you're a leader and being able to message, this is why we don't have the money for this. And there's a lot of information coming out right now of cuts that are coming through the Army, especially cuts to training, cuts to opportunities that a lot of people are looking forward to. And that stems from when Congress is saying we need to cut funds.
Mhm.
So I think going back to how can you get involved in the NDA is, number one, find out. It's not just about writing your congressman, because I feel like sometimes that is a start and it's good, and I'm glad we're doing it, but it can feel very transactional and distant. I think it's getting to know, who is your congressman? Are they on one of the armed services committees? Like, are they the ones that are making decisions, and who are the ones that are making those decisions on our defense budget? And then it's messaging them. And the next time you're in DC, go to Capitol Hill and arrange a meeting where you can, even if you have 15 minutes, to go, this is really important to us and to our community, and this is why. They're human beings that are always looking, and their staffers too are always looking for that information. And so being able to give voice to, this is what matters, it is because of our community voicing that to Congress, why we're seeing the mold crisis starting to turn, why Congress is now giving money to make the DoD and hold them accountable to fixing the mold crisis, why they're now looking at food insecurity. All of that comes down to our community that reached out and said, this is a real issue and we need somebody to be on top of it. And it's also realizing you have the power as a constituent. They represent you. And so if something is that important to you, you can reach out to that person and say, this is what's important to our community. Even better if you can get a collective amount of data of the community to say, this is why this is important. So I know it feels very detached and distant, but this affects our lives every day. And we're not the average American citizen who just gets a paycheck from a corporation. We have the government is the one that's looking over and responsible for our well-being. And so we have to be the ones that message that information as well.
Absolutely. And Chris McGee, he even says that Corie's 100% correct. It requires an engaged citizen. And I do want to point out something with both Chris McGee and my friend Liz Hensel. Hensel is the one who started the initiative that is now in place for us to all have a pet reimbursement. We all get $2,000 back per year overseas travel, and I believe it's $500 in CONUS. And what I want to point out about Chris and Liz is that neither one of them were part of some major lobbying organization. They both used the system exactly as you're talking about. Chris, I believe, liaisoned with a senator in Maine, I want to say. And then Liz Hensel worked with Corie Booker. And by the way, Liz was not from New Jersey. She just knew that Corie Booker was a animal lover and he was very concerned about animal issues. And so she had some time in previous life of being a congressional staffer. So she understood how to reach some of the staffers. Maybe she had a little bit of an advantage, but I would argue for both those cases, though they're both textbook examples, and they're both have military affiliation of one person starting a movement to drive change forward. And Chris is still actively working on his initiative, which was to get transparency in the numbers of suicide rates by job code.
And can I say, Chris, I'm working on that on the back end. So I just want you to know that I'm tracking what you're doing and so grateful for what you're doing on that. I'm going to give two very quick good news stories on that to answer your question on the NDA. Number one, when I saw Kilmer, who was the representative out of Washington State, I don't live in Washington State, but when I saw him introduce a bill about holding the DoD accountable to the mental health crisis that's happening inside, I knew that's in my lane, right? I went to Capitol Hill and I arranged a meeting and I sat down with him just to do exactly what I'm telling you to do with other leaders and said, I believe in this bill. This is why I see it boots on the ground. How can I help you? How can I help you get this to the point of it becoming law so that the DoD has to follow through?
Like, what I love about this, I just want to stop one quick saying is that you said, how can I help you?
Yes.
You didn't say, I need you to do this for me.
Yes.
All right.
And that's key to relationship building. And so I said, I don't have any dog in this fight. Like, I'm not needing anything. I'm not looking for my name to be published anywhere. I need you to succeed and I need the DoD to succeed and I need families to get well. Who do I connect you with and what can I do to help you? And that started a relationship where they called me back, right? So like, that's number one. And that opened up into more conversations and that turned into more opportunities. And that rolled into the DoD asking me like, what the heck is going on here, right? So it turned into more conversations. But I hope Heba will forgive me for sharing a little bit of this story. But I also want to give, this is about relationship building. I interviewed Heba for the podcast episode about money. She's a former congressional staffer, now a military spouse, and works as this liaison between the DoD and the Hill. And she called me one day, and I think it was a senator, reached out to her and said, hey, the NDAA is about to pass, but I noticed that there's not enough information in the NDAA to support military spouses. Can you write something in 48 hours? Heba let me put this in context. Heba, a military spouse, was tasked to basically write a bill in 48 hours to support our community. And she did it. And she was the person that was wise enough to not put all of her own desires in there, but actually reach out and seek wisdom in the community to see what actually needed to happen. Now, there's a lot of things that can happen between that now and getting passed, but I just want to give the message that Sometimes everybody's doing the best that they can. And there are key people that are trying to make a difference in those really what feels like far off things. And all of this comes down to relationships. And can you ask for what you need in kindness? And also, can you do it in a way that builds relationships instead of destroying them? I just have found that to be more productive.
I agree 100%. And we are now already like, I feel like I've just blinked and then opened my eyes, and now the hour is up because this has been such a fascinating discussion. But before we end the call, is there anything else that you would like to say or add or put out to the community about some of these issues? I definitely will now put the banner here for where we can find more information about you, but go right ahead.
Yeah. So first of all, just thank you for having me. I enjoy these conversations. We need more of them. Like, yes, I can write a book, you're right, but this really comes down to having conversations. And that's why I wanted to write it in the first place, is to spark more conversations where we can actually impact change. And so I just want to encourage those of you who are doing amazing work to advocate for our community. It makes a difference. And please don't tire out. Take care of yourself, but continue to advocate for the people that are around you, because our community really does need it. If you've not picked up the book, it is a dense read. I did read it so that our military academia would be willing to pick it up and use it as a cultural analysis into our community. But I also wrote it so that leaders could read it and feel like they were challenged as leaders, and that spouses could read it and it wouldn't be over their heads. So it's for everyone, but hopefully we'll spark conversations. My favorite story is actually hearing couples reading it, where each of them want their own book and they're arguing and fighting over the book, but it's creating insightful dialogue into their own relationship and their own experience within the culture. So thank you for having me, and thank you for asking such fantastic questions. Thank you for those of you who've been watching and asking questions, Jess, and I saw Chris as well. And so you guys are doing amazing things too, and I'm grateful.
Yes. In fact, I will say that you've brought your audience with you, because I have over 16. I can see up in this little ticker here, I've got 16 live viewers, 12 on X. I've got a bunch from your Facebook. So thank you so much to Corie's audience also for joining us on this call. It's been incredible, Corie. I'm in awe of what you're doing. And I think that you're an inspiration for so many of us, because I do think that I tend to sometimes be the guns blazing advocate, and I've got to back off and
I'm
really,
with you.
and I've got to be the one to have.
We just have to choose the time and day to do it together.
Right. Absolutely.
Thank you.
No, thank you so much. I will meet you backstage to say goodbye while I just go full screen for a moment, but thank you again.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you for having me.
All right, guys. Well, as I said, happy Thursday. Please enjoy hopefully you have a long Easter weekend ahead of you. I know I do. I'll be back with you guys this coming Thursday with another guest, but between now and then, I hope you all take care of yourselves. As I always say, take care of each other. Please, if you're joining me on YouTube, please subscribe or follow me wherever you're finding this show for more episodes. And I hope you all have an amazing week and rest of your week and weekend. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye now.